Hey Nick,
Hey Liam.
why do woodworms have no friends?
I don't know. Why don't woodworms have friends?
Because they're boring.
Because they bore through wood. Funny. I get it. Roll the intro.
Hello and welcome to ENTOCAST, and this month we shall be talking about a couple of things which kind of work together. The first of which is citizen science and how this can interact with entomology. And the second one, kind of leading on from that, is, and you might want to alert the Daily Mail here, we're going to be talking about invasive species.
Dum dum dum.
And how specifically citizen science and the mobilisation of all sorts of people across the country can be really helpful in recording the spread of species as they move across a new country.
Yeah, so first of all, I was wondering, what do we actually mean by citizen science? Because is it just people doing science, or is it a specific type of thing?
Because, technically all scientists are citizens.
Yeah, I mean, I still live here in the UK down inside. I'm still a citizen, right? That's right.
Do we have a definition of citizen science?
So the definition I got from Google was collection and analysis of data relating to the natural world by members of the general public, typically as part of a collaborative project with professional scientists. And the thing I found really interesting there is it mentions specifically the natural world. So is this something that is done predominantly by us? I mean, I guess it's hard to equip every citizen with a particle accelerator to do a bit of citizen physics, but is it predominantly something that's done in the natural world?
And another thing I found interesting is that term collaboration between what we deem the general public or the lay people and professional researchers. And I think one of the reasons why is the natural world in particular is because something which you mentioned before, we talk about the kind of biophilia, the innate connection that people do feel with nature. And I think look at shows like Planet Earth 2 and Countryfile and Springwatch, those kind of things are getting huge audiences. So there definitely seems to be an appetite there.
Yeah, there's definitely an appetite, and also from a very pragmatic point of view, it was really, really helpful because a lot of the issues, especially with things like invasive species and trying to catalogue all the different species and where they're present, is just the amount of effort that's involved. And there's been several studies that have looked at the benefits of citizen science. And one of the big ones they found is that if you were essentially going to give people money, pay them for the work they do in the citizen science, you'd be looking at projects valued at millions and millions of pounds just because there's thousands of people. And if you pay them even minimum wage for their time and effort, they are providing so much, really. Like the man hours are in the tens of thousands. So it is incredibly valuable.
I guess that begs the question then. It's clear that there's this huge value of it to the research, but what is the value to the citizens themselves? I guess it's something along the lines of just the pleasure of actually being a part of this big science project.
Almost certainly, and I think like you say as well, with these programs like Blue Planet and Springwatch and things that generate these massive audiences, there is interest out there, and there's definitely almost a hunger for it. And I think for many people, being a part of something like this, being actually a part of science, is something they don't get to do in their everyday lives. So it is something quite cool. It's like, oh, what do you do this weekend? Oh, I hung out a nest to catch some wasps or something like that. Harking back to the citizen science project we talked about with Syrian, with the big wasp survey.
And I guess as well, you also get that sense of ownership from kind of the final results of the study, which is one of the reasons why I think, which leads us on to the next thing, why citizen science projects involving mapping the spread of species work so well, because people can record species for the first time and put that first dot on the map, and then they have a real sense of ownership of that data then, because that is their record and that's there for all time.
And like we were talking about with the guys at the RHS, sometimes it's members of the public that find these invasives first, and then we can say definitively, right, okay, we have this species here, now what?
So a lovely episode coming up today where we're tying together a couple of themes that we've explored briefly before. So without much further ado from us, we decided to talk to someone who really is an expert on citizen science and has been involved with citizen science projects in the past. So we spoke to Professor Helen Roy.
I'm Helen Roy, and I'm at the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, where I lead the zoological side of things within the Biological Record Centre. And essentially that means I work with lots and lots of volunteer recording schemes and societies covering all kinds of different animals. And we use that data for looking at environmental change, addressing questions around environmental change.
Okay, so what particular questions are you trying to address in terms of climatic change?
So specifically, I'm extremely interested in non-native species and have been doing lots of work around the numbers of new arrivals that we're getting year on year. And I'm particularly interested in how that has effects on our native wildlife, for instance, but also on other wildlife as well. So we have about 2,000 non-native species in the UK. About 15% of those cause some kind of problem. I'm really interested in the problems to biodiversity, but other people are interested in problems to the economy or society. But from the biodiversity perspective, it's really fascinating to try and understand how these new arrivals are affecting other species and indeed ecosystem function.
So you say non-native species, I guess most people would instantly jump to, the invasives, and I think they're the one that tend to grab media attention. You say it's only about 15%, so is there examples of some non-native which maybe aren't invasive?
Yeah, well, that's really an excellent question, because I think it's really important that we make that distinction. So a non-native species is a species that's been introduced from one part of the world to another by humans. The invasive non-native species are those that are the damaging component of all of those others. So I think a really excellent example of a ladybird that has arrived and that we really enjoy seeing is the Bryony ladybird. And it is quite a large and hairy ladybird, and what's not to love about that? And it just feeds on white bryony. And it was found in the back garden of someone in Surrey, actually by a child, they found it, in the mid-1990s. And if you were to look at a distribution map of it now, it's hardly found anywhere, it's not spread very far at all. But in contrast, if you look at the Harlequin ladybird, which arrived in 2004 and spread at about 100 kilometres per year, and covered the whole of England into Wales and just about getting to Scotland. You can see there's a very big difference between those species. The Bryony ladybird just feeds on white bryony. The Harlequin ladybird will feed on a whole variety of different species. It is an aphid predator, but it likes feeding on many, many other insects too. It will also feed on soft fruits, for instance. It's an incredible generalist. Very different ladybirds.
So do you see non-natives cross that threshold from just being a non-native species to a non-native invasive species?
So in some cases we can't make the predictions as to whether a species is going to be a non-native species or whether it's going to show some invasive tendencies. And I guess there's all kinds of degrees of those sort of tendencies and interactions that it will have with other species. So when we think about, for example, in freshwater systems, things such as zebra mussels, which are a non-native species. They're an invasive non-native species because they have such dramatic effects on the water quality, and they change the algal communities, which has a cascade throughout the whole food chain. So there's a real ecosystem change there. We would make those kind of predictions that species, because it's such an effective filter feeder and for a whole variety of traits, that it will behave like that. But in other cases, sometimes it's really difficult to know, and even with a species like the Harlequin ladybird, where it's really highly suggestive that it's going to have very negative impacts. We need to know more about the kind of extent of those impacts and get a better understanding of when we know, for example, that it will eat two-spot ladybirds, but what does that mean for ecosystem functions? How does that play out within the whole kind of network of species all interacting with one another? So it's incredibly complicated.
You've talked a little bit there about the Harlequin ladybird as an example. You were integral in the recording schemes that were tracking its spreads. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So yeah, when the Harlequin ladybird was first recorded in 2004, we saw it as a real opportunity to be able to track its invasion and begin to understand a little bit more about this particular invasive non-native species. We knew as soon as it arrived there was nothing that could be done about it. There's no specific control strategies. Also, it arrived and it kind of boomed really rapidly, so it wasn't as if it was a very early invasion where something could be done. So, for example, the Asian hornet, which has been picked up a few times very recently, has been just nests that have been able to be eradicated, so there's been action taken. With the Harlequin ladybird, it went from being a few records to being an awful lot of records over a very, very short space of time. but seeing the opportunity to be able to track the invasion and engage people in recording ladybirds more broadly, but also in understanding non-native species biology and trying to convey some of the messages around the difference between non-native species and invasive non-native species, and also the importance of biosecurity and the importance of preventing the arrival of some species in the first place. Because with the Harlequin ladybird, in some senses, that's the only chance we had, was to prevent its arrival in the first place. And there are other species for which we can try and do that. So we've been doing a lot of work around so-called horizon scanning, making those predictions about what are the next species that are going to arrive in the next 10 years and threaten biodiversity, for instance, in Britain. So we knew the Asian hornet was on the horizon, so we were able to put in place plans for a response when it did arrive. And it's about having those plans in place and trying to prevent the arrival and ensuring biosecurity. That's the way forward.
So a lot of this data, it sounds like, relies on citizen science. I think is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
So how do you see the role of citizen science and recording in monitoring the spread of these invasives?
So I really think one of the things the Harlequin Ladybird survey showed us was that people are amazing in terms of their enthusiasm to contribute and to get involved and to send in records. And we're getting tens of thousands of records now every year, not just of the Harlequin Ladybird, but of all the different ladybird species. So that was really compelling evidence that people can help in terms of surveillance and monitoring for invasive non-native species. And we're seeing the same with the Asian hornet. We have online systems for people to send in sightings of concern, that they think they may have seen an Asian hornet. We also have a smartphone app called Asian Hornet Watch, and we're getting fantastic response. Thankfully, most of the pictures that we get to see are of European hornets and also of the hornet mimicking hoverfly. But the fact is there have been a couple of sightings of Asian hornet, and because of that rapid detection, the nests have been eradicated successfully. So it's really important as well to keep people aware that it's an ongoing problem and that their involvement in surveillance and monitoring is absolutely critical for ecologists and for decision makers, policy makers, conservation people to be able to make the decisions on the ground.
So that's talking about the impact of citizen science for us as the scientists, but what impact do you see it having, or do you know of it having, on the actual citizens who are partaking in it?
So I think it'd be really wonderful to see more studies around looking at the benefits to people for getting involved. And, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. So we have people telling us how it helps them in terms of their well-being, the connection with nature, how important that is to people in terms of just their general well-being. And there are some studies coming through now from a social science perspective that's highlighting the importance to people of connecting with nature, but also in terms of their understanding of science and perhaps making behavioural changes as well. But I think that we can do a lot more going forward to actually study and quantify and evaluate the success of citizen science with respect to the people. And that's why interdisciplinary research is really important, because I really enjoy the human component of citizen science, and I really enjoy the stories that people have to tell me about the ladybirds they see or their experiences of recording wildlife. But I don't have what's required to be able to have a deep understanding of their motivations or the behavioural changes that might have been brought about. But we're seeing social scientists getting more and more interested, and that interaction between social scientists and ecologists is really going to show some great results, I think, in the coming years.
So these sound like some really great benefits of citizen science, especially with monitoring invasive species. Are there any downsides in citizen science and getting ordinary people involved with this kind of research?
I see, I'm always so optimistic. It's really hard for me to think of the downsides of these things. So I think in terms of when I look across, for example, with the Harlequin Ladybird survey, I think communication has been really important. And when we first launched the survey, we weren't clear about what our aims were, and we weren't clear that there's nothing that anyone can do about the Harlequin Ladybird. And I think that probably that was quite disappointing for people. So in a way, a downside might have been sort of the messaging from us. But we learned really rapidly that it was really important that we did communicate really fully to people, and that people are really interested and they want to hear the detail and they want to have the feedback and to know how their data has played an important role within a science project. So I can't really think of too many downsides. Of course, people are giving up an amazing amount of their time to get involved, and that's really, really fantastic. And I definitely think as the sort of scientists involved within these projects, we have a huge responsibility to make sure that we value and make the best use of that information that they're providing to us, and that we involve them to the extent they wish to be involved within the science.
Something that I've heard critics touting as against citizen science is the issue of data quality.
Yeah.
Now, it's my understanding this has largely actually been debunked, and there's steps that we can take as scientists to mean that's not an issue. Is there anything in your mind? Have you come across this yourself?
Yeah, it's definitely that there are concerns around, people get concerned about data quality, but I think you're quite right. I think that mostly it has been debunked now in terms of scientists who are implementing citizen science projects are thinking very hard about how they can ensure that the data quality is the best it possibly can be. And so with the Ladybird survey, for instance, we do a lot of verification checks in terms of species ID, but also in terms of locality as well. And so we have part of our database which is really the verified data, and we know that we can ask all kinds of questions from that. But then we have a whole set where we haven't been able to verify the species ID, maybe because we haven't got a photo and we don't know who sent in that information. But that data can still be useful for some other questions. And it's about understanding your data set and knowing where the biases might be and what limitations that will then pose in terms of the questions that you can ask. And so we know we have this really fantastic part of the data set which is verified, and we can really be confident in that. But we can also ask some questions of the other data as well, and particularly for some of the really common and widespread species. So I think that we've worked really hard as a community to improve our communication around understanding these data sets and understanding the bias. There can also be bias, of course, with the spatial side of it. So there are some areas where there's a lot of recording goes on, and there's some areas where there's not so much recording, and how that then influences the analysis we do. Of course, we can put that into our statistical models and counteract those kind of biases. So we've been doing an awful lot of thinking in the Biological Record Centre about these biases and what we can do to address them, and how we can make the very best use of all of the data that we get.
To peel back the curtain a little bit, we're actually meeting you today at the postgraduate forum that the RES has put on, and we saw you talk today, and I just thought you had the most fascinating career. You seem to have gone almost everywhere, so I was wondering, how has entomology allowed you to travel the world, and how did you get involved with all these different projects across the world?
Yeah, so I have had just the most amazing opportunities and the most amazing experiences. And I think in some cases I've sought out those experiences. So for example, I really wanted to go to Africa, to East Africa, and so volunteering for the Tropical Biology Association allowed me to do that. But in other cases, for example, when I went to Chile and we were finding Harlequin ladybirds high up in the Andes, there's some collaborators that I met at a conference within Europe who are based in Chile, and then we just started to work together on a collaborative grant, and I was just delighted to be involved with them and with their research. I think that meeting people at various conferences and taking the opportunities to get involved with research around the world has just been fantastic. And I think the entomology community is just such a warm and welcoming community. And I think as well that most research now involves big collaborations, and not one of us has all the skills necessary to do every aspect of the project. We've got really massive questions that we need to be addressing, and we need big teams and lots of ideas to do that. And the way for me has been working with these big teams and collaborations, and I've had a lot of good fortune in leading a number of European-wide projects in recent years. So, for example, for the European Commission, but also through the Cost Action Alien Challenge. And that's, again, taken me to lots of different places. And then you meet more people, and then you go to more places. It's sort of stepping stones. And I do really enjoy the travel. And it does seem the Harlequin ladybird, so there's a whole global community of people studying just the Harlequin ladybird. And we all get along tremendously well, and so we're all sharing ideas, and we're all delighted when we get an opportunity to work with one another. So actually next September we have a meeting in the Azores where we're coming together because we've been working on the Harlequin ladybird in part through an international organisation of biocontrol working group. And now the IUCN has set up a specialist group on ladybirds, which is really exciting. So we're going to be kicking off that special group in the Azores alongside this other meeting. And we've just been very lucky to have the opportunities, and there's just an amazing community out there.
And are you going to the Azores because it's a really good spot for Harlequin ladybirds?
So, well, interestingly, there are quite, actually they're interesting in that, so the southern Mediterranean is not very invaded. So it's actually very interesting as to why is the Harlequin ladybird not doing well on the Azores. It's not there. I have been to the Azores once already for an island invasions meeting, which was fantastic. And yeah, it is absolutely beautiful. It reminded me very much of Cornwall though, which I love. I'm a real fan of Cornwall. So it was like being in Cornwall, but having had a very long journey.
Brilliant. And one of the other things that you said in your talk was, I believe I'm quoting you correctly here, that you said ladybirds were the best group. So I was wondering why that is, and also do you have a favourite ladybird?
So I have had a passion for ladybirds for many, many years. So I'm 48 now, and I can think back to early memories, age 6, of ladybirds in the back garden. So for me, they've always just been extremely special. And I think they're a fantastic group to study because there's so much diversity in their life histories. And there's mildew feeders, there's predatory ladybirds, there's plant-feeding ladybirds. Some of them wake up early from spring, some of them a bit later, all kinds of different interesting phenologies. So they're a fascinating group in that way. And then, of course, when you throw the Harlequin in and you have this invasive model species, that makes them a great group to study. But I'm sure that other people can tell me of other fantastic groups to study. There are other groups out there. But for me, I'm quite fickle about my kind of top few ladybirds. I love the heather ladybird because it has a wonderful, unique spot pattern. And I also really like the orange ladybird, just because I just can remember the first time of seeing these species as well. And they're just so stunning and so beautiful. The hieroglyphic ladybird is becoming one of my favourites because it's getting so tricky to find it. And so it kind of, there's a sadness about that, but also there's a sort of sense of adventure. And I think that as much as I talk about the work that I've done overseas, I love doing work in the UK as well. And taking a trip to the Surrey Heathlands, for example, and you can find 15 species of the conspicuous ladybirds in one day, really quite easily, including the rarity that is Coccinella magnifica, the scarce 7-spot. So fieldwork in the UK is also fantastic, and I've had amazing experiences of taking students on fieldwork to Poland, to the Red Sea, but also in the UK. And we have fantastic wildlife and fantastic natural history just here on our doorstep. So I think there's a huge amount to be said for making sure we have a good understanding of that wildlife.
So if anyone has been swayed by our chat here and would love to get involved with some citizen science, have you got any pointers and signposts somewhere they could get involved with?
Well, of course, we would love them to send their ladybird records to the Ladybird Survey and either downloading the smartphone app, I Record Ladybirds. But also, there are other groups out there, and iRecord is a great place for people to make the recordings of all of the different wildlife that they see. But I think there's some really great hypothesis testing type citizen science projects out there as well that people can get involved with. So it's great just to see what's going on out there. And I think as well, if people want to launch their own citizen science project, I think there's some great guidance out there, and web tools and apps have got much easier to develop, and it's much more cheap now to be able to develop them. So I think, if people have ideas, and it doesn't have to be at a UK scale, it could be at a village scale or on people's allotments or in their back garden. Just think that science is so exciting, and it's kind of, to me, it's so accessible to everyone that, it doesn't need to be huge, it doesn't need to be really ambitious, it just can be exciting.
So it was absolutely wonderful for Helen to join us there. She's a gem. Honestly, she was so nice to us, and she came to the pub with us afterwards. It was a wonderful, wonderful time, and it was a great interview with her. What did you think, Liam?
Yeah, fantastic. I've heard Helen speak a few times before, and she always delivers a fantastic talk. Very, very good at engaging us, and absolutely related to citizen science and mapping. It got me personally really excited, and after I heard her spoke, I downloaded the Ladybird recording app on my phone, and I was putting records of different ladybird species I saw out and about.
I still couldn't, when I saw her talk and in this interview as well, I couldn't get over the idea of how quickly the Harlequin ladybird spread. Like, it was kilometres at a time each year. It was crazy.
Yeah, I'll say again to the listeners, if you haven't seen the little animated infographic that the CH produced showing that, I really recommend checking out. It is quite dramatic to see the coloured dots kind of like a tide washing over the UK.
Yeah, we'll be sure to put that in the show notes as well. So you should be able to find that in the podcast info.
And something we touched on in the interview, which I'd just like to talk about a little bit further, I found really interesting, was the idea between, what makes something invasive and what makes something just foreign and benign, or even potentially like a benefit. And so I was just thinking to myself about some certain examples. So we had a really, really nice one win the Harlequin ladybird as a big bad pest, which is bad news when it turns up, but in such big numbers now we can't do much about it. And then similarly we have another one which at the moment we can do stuff about because we're catching it in the early stage, and that's the Asian hornet. But yeah, it's not always necessarily bad news. And something, I don't know if you have any experience with this, Nick, but the interesting spread was, for me, is the Bombus hypnorum, the tree bumblebee.
Yeah.
So this is something that turned up in 2001 in Wiltshire, and it's a European bumblebee species, and I think originally actually from northern central Europe, and it's kind of spread down, then came across, and then spread up in like a horseshoe. And I think this is something we spoke about in the bee episode before, but I'd just like to come back to it as a really nice example of something which is not necessarily bad news when it turns up. Being a bumblebee, it's providing pollination services, and one of the key things is it's not competing with native bumblebees for nesting habitat, because it tends to nest high up in bird boxes and under the eaves of houses rather than in the ground.
And I think that's one of the crucial differences between what makes a non-native species and an invasive species, is when it starts to compete with the natural fauna, then it's whether it's causing damage, then it's an invasive species. But it's funny because you see all these headlines, like you said, the Daily Mail at the beginning, and you think that every species that is non-native is bad. It's bad news. It's going to cause terrible things. And to be honest, because of the coverage, it seems like that is more or less the case, but it's not necessarily.
And without getting too political, sometimes I do wonder if there's certain kind of metaphors in some of these headlines about organisms coming over from different countries. But yeah, that's the
Is that because we're talking about the Daily Mail, for instance?
Possibly, but not ecologically relevant.
Couldn't possibly comment on that. Couldn't possibly comment.
But I think the degree of damage for it to be invasive only has to be very subtle. Any species which comes into a new ecosystem is going to change it in some aspect just by being there. In terms of nutrient flow, in terms of food webs, all these things. Yeah, sometimes there are some quite dramatic spreads, but they're not necessarily major problems. I think there's quite a few invasive species, but we're not as worried as we are about some of the so-called big boy kind of ones. But another one I found quite interesting is the horse chestnut leaf miner, tiny little leaf miner moths, as the name suggests, horse chestnut trees. And it's such a small animal, very, very tiny, but you look at some trees, especially in inner cities, and they're absolutely hammered by this tiny moth, and every leaf is just brown.
Yeah, that is a slightly different example of an invasive from Bombus hypnorum, of where you can see the clear damage being caused by it.
And I guess as well, the speed at which they spread will also affect kind of how visible they are, and in combination with the type of habitat it's hitting. So something we talked about at the RHS was the box tree caterpillar, and this is something, it hasn't had a really big wide spread. It's still kind of confined around the London area, but it's something that's very visible because it's on people's gardens, on their box hedge, which is a big feature in a lot of people's gardens. So as soon as it comes in, we detected it quite quickly, and now we're monitoring the spread very closely.
Yeah, and I think the speed of the spread as well shows how well we can control it. With something like the Harlequin ladybird, we have no chance. It's just too quick. There's nothing we can do, and there's too many different niches it can inhabit. When something's more specific, it's a little bit easier to track, and also there's speed. If it's slow enough, then we can do something about it. So I think there are a lot of different elements to invasives, but I think bringing it back to citizen science stuff, just being able to monitor it, be able to track these speeds, to be able to track where it is, can be so helpful in trying to do it. Because I think, as Helen touched on, in this climate change future, this is going to be a big thing going forward, and we're going to see a lot of different species moving across the world in places where they're not. And I think with the movement of humans as well, we are getting a more uniform flora and fauna across the world, and it's how we deal with that going forwards.
Something I heard recently, which I thought was really interesting, is there's this paradox between, you look at any individual region and the number of species there is increasing because of the introduction of invasives, but you look on a global scale and there's no denying it, the number of species is decreasing because of extinctions. And it's like this paradox because, loads of stuff's going extinct, but then it's been in any region replaced by invasives, but overall that's the bad thing.
No, certainly, and I think a good example of that is, again, going back to bumblebees, Bombus terrestris seems to be the bumblebee around the world, because while it's absolutely fine here in Europe and the UK where it's native, in the US and parts of Asia as well, it's becoming very invasive and it's outcompeting other bumblebees. So are we heading towards a future where we only have a few different species because of these invasions?
Yeah, and then there's kind of, how do we manage that as humans? Obviously, we want to control everything, but do we want, just a few species which are going to provide the ecosystem services, or do we want a more resilient, natural, high biodiversity background for things going on?
And how much do we conserve as well? Because nature is, by definition, in flux. There will be species coming and going. Part of that is natural. The Bombus hypnorum coming to UK, that seemed fairly natural. It wasn't interrupting other niches. But with other species, is there that natural thing? And with these monitoring schemes, with this citizen science, we can have a more informed way of trying to make that call.
Absolutely. And something I always think about as well is, we've talked about just a handful of species as examples, but I'm sure there'll be loads of species that we haven't even picked up yet, which are being moved around, and we don't know what impact they're having on ecosystems. And this is something where there's no way that researchers have enough manpower to kind of start describing the systems, and this is somewhere where citizen science could really change the game.
Exactly. I think a good example of that was when we talked to Jess for the Christmas special. I don't think many people would even realise there will be invasions going on near the Antarctic Peninsula, but there are things being spread even around there in that harsher habitats. So.
And who knows, if there were citizen scientists down there, then maybe we would have picked it up a lot earlier.
Yeah, very, very brave citizen scientists with very big coats. Well, I think that's all we've got time for this time, but thank you again for listening in with us, and we just want to thank the Royal Entomological Society again. Massive thank you for the sponsorship of this show.
And as always, please feel free to rate and comment, and you can contact us at entocast.gmail, and of course on Twitter.
Yeah, we're always on Twitter. We've got a Facebook group as well. Just search ENTOCAST and you'll find us.
Brilliant. And thank you again for listening. See you soon.
Goodbye. I am talking about science. I am Professor Helen Roy. Blah, blah, blah.
Do not, you imposter!